You like so much to be alone? Yes, as long as my friends keep me from feeling lonely. She sat down near the fire and said, Nastasia will bring the tea presently, and signed to him to return to his armchair, adding, I see you've already chosen your corner. Leaning back, she folded her arms behind her head and looked at the fire under drooping lids. This is the hour I like best, don't you? A proper sense of his dignity caused him to answer, I was afraid you'd forgotten the hour. Beaufort must have been very engrossing. She looked amused. Why? Have you waited long? Mr. Beaufort took me to see a number of houses, since it seems I'm not to be allowed to stay in this one. She appeared to dismiss both Beaufort and himself from her mind, and went on, I've never been in a city where there seems to be such a feeling against living in des quartiers excentriques. What does it matter where one lives? I'm told this street is respectable. It's not fashionable. Fashionable? Do you all think so much of that? Why not make one's own fashions? But I suppose I've lived too independently. At any rate, I want to do what you all do. I want to feel cared for and safe. He was touched, as he had been the evening before when she spoke of her need of guidance. That's what your friends want you to feel. New York's an awfully safe place, he added with a flash of sarcasm. Yes, isn't it? One feels that, she cried, missing the mockery. Being here is like being taken on a holiday when one has been a good little girl and done all one's lessons. The analogy was well meant, but did not altogether please him. He did not mind being flippant about New York, but disliked to hear anyone else take the same tone. He wondered if she did not begin to see what a powerful engine it was, and how nearly it had crushed her. The Lovell Mingotts' dinner, patched up in extremis, out of all sorts of social odds and ends, ought to have taught her the narrowness of her escape. But either she had been all along unaware of having skirted disaster, or else she had lost sight of it in the triumph of the van der Luyden evening. Archer inclined to the former theory. He fancied that her New York was still completely undifferentiated, and the conjecture nettled him. Last night, he said, New York laid itself out for you. The van der Luydens do nothing by halves. No. How kind they are. 'Twas such a nice party. Everyone seems to have such an esteem for them. The terms were hardly adequate. She might have spoken in that way of a tea party at the dear old Miss Lanning's. The van der Luydens, said Archer, feeling himself pompous as he spoke, are the most powerful influence in New York society. Unfortunately, owing to her health, they receive very seldom. She unclasped her hands from behind her head and looked at him meditatively. Isn't that perhaps the reason? The reason? For their great influence? That they make themselves so rare? He colored a little, stared at her, and suddenly felt the penetration of the remark. At a stroke, she had pricked the van der Luydens, and they collapsed. He laughed and sacrificed them. Nastasia brought the tea, with handleless Japanese cups and little covered dishes, placing the tray on a low table. But you'll explain these things to me. You'll tell me all I ought to know. Madame Olenska continued, leaning forward to hand him his cup. It's you who are telling me, opening my eyes to things I'd looked at so long I'd ceased to see them. She detached a small gold cigarette case from one of her bracelets, held it out to him, and took a cigarette herself. On the chimney were long spills for lighting them. Ah, then we can both help each other. but I want help so much more. You must tell me just what to do." It was on the tip of his tongue to reply, "Don't be seen driving about the streets with Beaufort." But he was being too deeply drawn into the atmosphere of the room, which was her atmosphere, and to give advice of that sort would have been like telling someone who was bargaining for attar of roses in Samarkand that one should always be provided with Arctics for a New York winter. New York seemed much farther off than Samarkand, and if they were indeed to help each other, she was rending what might prove the first of their mutual services by making him look at his native city objectively. Viewed thus, as through the wrong end of a telescope, it looked disconcertingly small and distant, but then from Samarkand it would. A flame darted from the logs, and she bent over the fire, stretching her thin hand so close to it that a faint halo shone about the oval nails. The light touched to russet the rings of dark hair escaping from her braids, and made her pale face paler. "There are plenty of people to tell you what to do," Archer rejoined, obscurely envious of them. "Oh, all my aunts? And my dear old granny?" She considered the idea impartially. "They're all a little vexed with me for setting up for myself. Poor granny especially. She wanted to keep me with her, but I had to be free." He was impressed by this light way of speaking of the formidable Catherine, and moved by the thought of what must have given Madame Olenska this thirst for even the loneliest kind of freedom. But the idea of Beaufort gnawed at him. "I think I understand how you feel," he said. "Still, your family can advise you, explain differences, show you the way." She lifted her thin black eyebrows. "Is New York such a labyrinth? I thought it so straight up and down, like Fifth Avenue, and with all the cross streets numbered." She seemed to guess his faint disapproval of this, and added, with the rare smile that enchanted her whole face, "If you knew how I like it for just that, the straight up and downness, and the big honest labels on everything." He saw his chance. Everything may be labeled, but everybody is not. Perhaps I may simplify too much, but you'll warn me if I do. She turned from the fire to look at him. "There are only two people here who make me feel as if they understood what I mean and could explain things to me. You and Mr. Beaufort." Archer winced at the joining of the names, and then, with a quick readjustment, understood, sympathized, and pitied. So close to the powers of evil she must have lived that she still breathed more freely in their air. But since she felt that he understood her also, his business would be to make her see Beaufort as he really was, with all he represented, and abhor it. He answered gently, "I understand. But just at first, don't let go of your old friend's hands. I mean the older women, your Granny Mingott, Mrs. Welland, Mrs. van der Luyden. They like and admire you. They want to help you." She shook her head and sighed. "Oh, I know. But on condition that they don't hear anything unpleasant. Aunt Welland put it in those very words when I tried. Does no one want to know the truth here, Mr. Archer? The real loneliness is living among all these kind people who only ask one to pretend." She lifted her hands to her face, and he saw her thin shoulders shaken by a sob. "Madame Olenska. Oh, don't. Ellen," he cried, starting up and bending over her. He drew down one of her hands, clasping and chafing it like a child's, while he murmured reassuring words. But in a moment she freed herself and looked up at him with wet lashes. "Does no one cry here, either? I suppose there's no need to, in heaven," she said, straightening her loosened braids with a laugh and bending over the tea kettle. It was burnt into his consciousness that he had called her Ellen, called her so twice, and that she had not noticed it. Far down the inverted telescope, he saw the faint white figure of May Welland in New York. Suddenly, Nastasia put her head in to say something in her rich Italian. Madame Olenska, again with a hand at her hair, uttered an exclamation of assent, a flashing "Già, già!" And the Duke of St. Austry entered, piloting a tremendous black-wigged and red-plumed lady in overflowing furs.
"My dear Countess, I've brought an old friend of mine to see you, Mrs. Struthers. She wasn't asked to the party last night, and she wants to know you."
The Duke beamed on the group, and Madame Olenska advanced with a murmur of welcome toward the queer couple. She seemed to have no idea how oddly matched they were, nor what a liberty the Duke had taken in bringing his companion, and to do him justice, as Archer perceived, the Duke seemed as unaware of it himself. "Of course I want to know you, my dear," cried Mrs. Struthers, in a round, rolling voice that matched her bold feathers and her brazen wig. "I want to know everybody who's young and interesting and charming. And the Duke tells me you like music. Didn't you, Duke? You're a pianist yourself, I believe. Well, do you want to hear Sarasate play tomorrow evening at my house? You know I've something going on every Sunday evening. It's the day when New York doesn't know what to do with itself, and so I say to it, 'Come and be amused.' And the Duke thought you'd be tempted by Sarasate. You'll find a number of your friends." Madame Olenska's face grew brilliant with pleasure. "How kind! How good of the Duke to think of me!" She pushed a chair up to the tea table, and Mrs. Struthers sank into it delectably. "Of course I shall be too happy to come." "That's all right, my dear, and bring your young gentleman with you." Mrs. Struthers extended a hail fellow hand to Archer. "I can't put a name to you, but I'm sure I've met you. I've met everybody here, or in Paris or London. Aren't you in diplomacy? All the diplomatists come to me. You like music too? Duke, you must be sure to bring him." The Duke said, "Rather," from the depths of his beard, and Archer withdrew with a stiffly circular bow that made him feel as full of spine as a self-conscious schoolboy among careless and unnoticing elders. He was not sorry for the denouement of his visit. He only wished it had come sooner, and spared him a certain waste of emotion. As he went out into the wintry night, New York again became vast and imminent, and May Welland the loveliest woman in it. He turned into his florist's to send her the daily box of lilies of the valley which, to his confusion, he found he had forgotten that morning. As he wrote a word on his card and waited for an envelope, he glanced about the embowered shop, and his eyes lit on a cluster of yellow roses. He had never seen any as sun-golden before, and his first impulse was to send them to May instead of the lilies. But they did not look like her. There was something too rich, too strong in their fiery beauty. In a sudden revulsion of mood, and almost without knowing what he did, he signed to the florist to lay the roses in another long box, and slipped his card into a second envelope, on which he wrote the name of the Countess Olenska. Then, just as he was turning away, he drew the card out again, and left the empty envelope on the box. "They'll go out at once?" he inquired, pointing to the roses. The florist assured him that they would. Chapter 10. The next day he persuaded May to escape for a walk in the park after luncheon. As was the custom in old-fashioned Episcopalian New York, she usually accompanied her parents to church on Sunday afternoons. But Mrs. Welland condoned her truancy, having that very morning won her over to the necessity of a long engagement, with time to prepare a hand-embroidered trousseau containing the proper number of dozens. The day was delectable. The bare vaulting of trees along the mall was sealed with lapis lazuli, and arched above snow that shone like splintered crystals. It was the weather to call out May's radiance, and she burned like a young maple in the frost. Archer was proud of the glances turned on her, and the simple joy of possessorship cleared away his underlying perplexities. "It's so delicious, waking every morning to smell lilies of the valley in one's room," she said. "Yesterday they came late. I hadn't time in the morning. But your remembering each day to send them makes me love them so much more than if you'd given a standing order, and they came every morning on the minute, like one's music teacher, as I know Gertrude Lefferts did, for instance, when she and Lawrence were engaged." "Ha! They would," laughed Archer, amused at her keenness. He looked sideways at her fruit-like cheek and felt rich and secure enough to add, "When I sent your lilies yesterday afternoon, I saw some rather gorgeous yellow roses and packed them off to Madame Olenska. Was that right?" "How dear of you. Anything of that kind delights her. It's odd she didn't mention it. She lunched with us today and spoke of Mr. Beaufort's having sent her wonderful orchids, and Cousin Henry van der Luyden a whole hamper of carnations from Skuytercliff. She seems so surprised to receive flowers. Don't people send them in Europe? She thinks it's such a pretty custom." "Oh, well, no wonder mine were overshadowed by Beaufort's," said Archer irritably. Then he remembered that he had not put a card with the roses, and was vexed at having spoken of them. He wanted to say, "I called on your cousin yesterday," but hesitated. If Madame Olenska had not spoken of his visit, it might seem awkward that he should. Yet not to do so gave the affair an air of mystery that he disliked. To shake off the question, he began to talk of their own plans, their future, and Mrs. Welland's insistence on a long engagement. "If you call it long, Isabel Chivers and Reggie were engaged for 2 years, Grace and Thorley for nearly a year and a half. Why aren't we very well off as we are?" It was the traditional maidenly interrogation, and he felt ashamed of himself for finding it singularly childish. No doubt she simply echoed what was said for her, but she was nearing her 22nd birthday, and he wondered at what age nice women began to speak for themselves. "Never. If we won't let them, I suppose," he mused, and recalled his mad outburst to Mr. Sillerton Jackson. "Women ought to be as free as we are." It would presently be his task to take the bandage from this young woman's eyes and bid her look forth on the world. But how many generations of the women who had gone to her making had descended bandaged to the family vault? He shivered a little, remembering some of the new ideas in his scientific books and the much-cited instance of the Kentucky cave fish, which had ceased to develop eyes because they had no use for them. What if, when he had bidden May Welland to open hers, they could only look out blankly at blankness? "We might be much better off. We might be all together. We might travel." Her face lit up. "That would be lovely," she owned. She would love to travel. But her mother would not understand their wanting to do things so differently. As if the mere differently didn't account for it, the wooer insisted. "Newland, you're so original," she exulted. His heart sank, for he saw that he was saying all the things that young men in the same situation were expected to say, and that she was making the answers that instinct and tradition taught her to make, even to the point of calling him original. original. We're all as like each other as those dolls cut out of the same folded paper. We're like patterns stenciled on a wall. Can't you and I strike out for ourselves, May?" He had stopped and faced her in the excitement of their discussion, and her eyes rested on him with a bright, unclouded admiration. "Mercy! Shall we elope?" She laughed. "If you would." "You do love me, Newland. I'm so happy." "But then, why not be happier? We can't behave like people in novels, though, can we? Why not? Why not? Why not?" She looked a little bored by his insistence. She knew very well that they couldn't, but it was troublesome to have to produce a reason. "I'm not clever enough to argue with you, but that kind of thing is rather vulgar, isn't it?" she suggested, relieved to have hit on a word that would assuredly extinguish the whole subject. "Are you so much afraid, then, of being vulgar?" She was evidently staggered by this. "Of course I should hate it. So would you," she rejoined, a trifle irritably. He stood silent, beating his stick nervously against his boot top, and feeling that she had indeed found the right way of closing the discussion, she went on lightheartedly. "Oh, did I tell you that I showed Ellen my ring? She thinks it's the most beautiful setting she ever saw. There's nothing like it in the Rue de la Paix, she said. I do love you, Newland, for being so artistic." The next afternoon, as Archer, before dinner, sat smoking sullenly in his study, Janey wandered in on him. He had failed to stop at his club on the way up from the office where he exercised the profession of the law in the leisurely manner common to well-to-do New Yorkers of his class. He was out of spirits and slightly out of temper, and a haunting horror of doing the same thing every day at the same hour besieged his brain. "Sameness, sameness," he muttered, the word running through his head like a persecuting tune as he saw the familiar tall-hatted figures lounging behind the plate glass, and because he usually dropped in at the club at that hour, he had gone home instead. He knew not only what they were likely to be talking about, but the part each one would take in the discussion. The Duke, of course, would be their principal theme, though the appearance in Fifth Avenue of a golden-haired lady in a small canary-colored brougham with a pair of black cobs, for which Beaufort was generally thought responsible, would also doubtless be thoroughly gone into. Such women, as they were called, were few in New York, those driving their own carriages still fewer, and the appearance of Miss Fanny Ring in Fifth Avenue at the fashionable hour had profoundly agitated society. Only the day before, her carriage had passed Mrs. Lovell Mingott's, and the latter had instantly rung the little bell at her elbow and ordered the coachman to drive her home. What if it had happened to Mrs. van der Luyden? People asked each other with a shudder. Archer could hear Lawrence Lefferts, at that very hour, holding forth on the disintegration of society. He raised his head irritably when his sister Janey entered, and then quickly bent over his book, Swinburne's Chastelard, just out, as if he hadn't seen her. She glanced at the writing table heaped with books, opened a volume of the Conte Drôlatique, made a wry face over the archaic French, and sighed, "What learned things you read." "Well?" he asked, as she hovered Cassandra-like before him. "Mother's very angry." "Angry? With whom? About what?" "Miss Sophie Jackson has just been here. She brought word that her brother would come in after dinner. She couldn't say very much, because he forbade her to. He wishes to give all the details himself. He's with Cousin Louisa van der Luyden now." "For heaven's sake, my dear girl, try a fresh start. It would take an omniscient deity to know what you're talking about." "It's not a time to be profane, Newland. Mother feels badly enough about your not going to church." With a groan, he plunged back into his book, Newland! Do listen. Your friend, Madame Olenska, was at Mrs. Lemuel Struthers' party last night. She went there with the Duke and Mr. Beaufort. At the last clause of this announcement, a senseless anger swelled the young man's breast. To smother it, he laughed. Well, what of it? I knew she meant to. Janey paled and her eyes began to project. You knew she meant to? And you didn't try to stop her? To warn her?
Stop her? Warn her? He laughed again. I'm not engaged to be married to the Countess Olenska.
The words had a fantastic sound in his own ears. You're marrying into her family.
Oh, family, family, he jeered.
Newland, don't you care about family?
Not a brass farthing.
Nor about what Cousin Louisa van der Luyden will think?
Not the half of one, if she thinks such old maids rubbish.
Mother is not an old maid, said his virgin sister with pinched lips. He felt like shouting back, yes, she is, and so are the van der Luydens, and so we all are when it comes to being so much as brushed by the wingtip of reality. But he saw her long, gentle face puckering into tears and felt ashamed of the useless pain he was inflicting.
Hang Countess Olenska. Don't be a goose, Janey. I'm not her keeper.
No, but you did ask the Wellens to announce your engagement sooner that we might all back her up. And if it hadn't been for that, Cousin Louisa would never have invited her to the dinner for the Duke.
Well, what harm was there in inviting her? She was the best-looking woman in the room. She made the dinner a little less funeral than the usual van der Luyden banquet.
You know Cousin Henry asked her to please you. He persuaded Cousin Louisa. And now they're so upset that they're going back to Skuytercliff tomorrow. I think, Newland, you'd better come down. You don't seem to understand how Mother feels.
In the drawing-room, Newland found his mother. She raised a troubled brow from her needlework to ask, Has Janey told you? Yes. He tried to keep his tone as measured as her own. But I can't take it very seriously. Not the fact of having offended Cousin Louisa and Cousin Henry. The fact that they can be offended by such a trifle as Countess Olenska's going to the house of a woman they consider common. Consider! Well, who is? But who has good music and amuses people on Sunday evenings when the whole of New York is dying of inanition. Good music? All I know is there was a woman who got up on a table and sang the things they sing in the places you go to in Paris. There was smoking and champagne. Well, that kind of thing happens in other places, and the world still goes on. I don't suppose, dear, you're really defending the French Sunday. I've heard you often enough, Mother, grumble at the English Sunday when we've been to London. New York is neither Paris nor London. Oh, no, it's not. Her son groaned. You mean, I suppose, that society here is not as brilliant. You're right, I dare say. But we belong here, and people should respect our ways when they come among us. Ellen Olenska, especially. She came back to get away from the kind of life people lead in brilliant societies. Newland made no answer, and after a moment his mother ventured, I was going to put on my bonnet and ask you to take me to see Cousin Louisa for a moment before dinner. He frowned, and she continued, I thought you might explain to her what you've just said, that society abroad is different, that people are not as particular, and that Madame Olenska may not have realized how we feel about such things. It would be, you know, dear, she added with an innocent adroitness, in Madame Olenska's interest if you did. Dearest Mother, I really don't see how we're concerned in the matter. The Duke took Madame Olenska to Mrs. Struthers. In fact, he brought Mrs. Struthers to call on her. I was there when they came. If the van der Luydens want to quarrel with anybody, the real culprit is under their own roof.
Quarrel? Newland, did you ever know of Cousin Henry's quarrelling? Besides, the Duke's his guest, and a stranger, too. Strangers don't discriminate. How should they? Countess Olenska is a New Yorker, and should have respected the feelings of New York.
Well, then, if they must have a victim, you have my leave to throw Madame Olenska to them, cried her son, exasperated. I don't see myself, or you either, offering ourselves up to expiate her crimes.
Oh, of course you see only the Mingott side, his mother answered, in the sensitive tone that was her nearest approach to anger. The sad butler drew back the drawing-room portieres and announced,
Mr. Henry van der Luyden.
Mrs. Archer dropped her needle and pushed her chair back with an agitated hand.
Another lamp?
She cried to the retreating servant, while Janey bent over to straighten her mother's cap. Mr. van der Luyden's figure loomed on the threshold, and Newland Archer went forward to greet his cousin.
We were just talking about you, sir, he said.
Mr. van der Luyden seemed overwhelmed by the announcement. He drew off his glove to shake hands with the ladies and smoothed his tall hat shyly, while Janey pushed an armchair forward and Archer continued.
And the Countess Olenska.
Mrs. Archer paled.
Ah, a charming woman. I have just been to see her,
said Mr. van der Luyden, complacency restored to his brow. He sank into the chair, laid his hat and gloves on the floor beside him in the old-fashioned way, and went on.
She has a real gift for arranging flowers. I had sent her a few carnations from Skuytercliff, and I was astonished. Instead of massing them in big bunches as our head gardener does, she had scattered them about loosely, here and there. I can't say how. The Duke had told me. He said, Go and see how cleverly she's arranged her drawing-room. And she has. I should really like to take Louisa to see her, if the neighborhood were not so unpleasant.
A dead silence greeted this unusual flow of words from Mr. van der Luyden. Mrs. Archer drew her embroidery out of the basket into which she had nervously tumbled it, and Newland, leaning against the chimney-place and twisting a hummingbird feather screen in his hand, saw Janey's gaping countenance lit up by the coming of the second lamp.
The fact is, Mr. van der Luyden continued, stroking his long grey leg with a bloodless hand weighed down by the patroon's great signet ring. The fact is, I dropped in to thank her for the very pretty note she wrote me about my flowers, and also, but this is between ourselves, of course, to give her a friendly warning about allowing the Duke to carry her off to parties with him. I don't know if you've heard.
Mrs. Archer produced an indulgent smile. Has the Duke been carrying her off to parties?
You know what these English grandees are. They're all alike. Louisa and I are very fond of our cousin, but it's hopeless to expect people who are accustomed to the European courts to trouble themselves about our little republican distinctions. The Duke goes where he's amused.
Mr. van der Luyden paused, but no one spoke.
Yes, it seems he took her with him last night to Mrs. Lemuel Struthers's. Sillerton Jackson has just been to us with the foolish story, and Louisa was rather troubled. So I thought the shortest way was to go straight to Countess Olenska and explain, by the merest hint, you know, how we feel in New York about certain things. I felt I might, without indelicacy, because the evening she dined with us, she rather suggested, Rather, let me see that she would be grateful for guidance. And she was.
Mr. van der Luyden looked about the room with what would have been self-satisfaction on features less purged of the vulgar passions. On his face it became a mild benevolence, which Mrs. Archer's countenance dutifully reflected.
How kind you both are, dear Henry. Always. Newland will particularly appreciate what you've done because of dear May and his new relations. She shot an admonitory glance at her son, who said, "Immensely, sir. But I was sure you'd like Madame Olenska."
Mr. van der Luyden looked at him with extreme gentleness.
"I never ask to my house, my dear Newland," he said, "anyone whom I do not like. And so I have just told Sillerton Jackson."
With a glance at the clock, he rose and added,
"But Louisa will be waiting. We are dining early to take the Duke to the opera."
After the portieres had solemnly closed behind their visitor, a silence fell upon the Archer family.
"Gracious! How romantic!"
at last broke explosively from Janey. No one knew exactly what inspired her elliptic comments, and her relations had long since given up trying to interpret them. Mrs. Archer shook her head with a sigh.
"Provided it all turns out for the best," she said, in the tone of one who knows how surely it will not. "Newland, you must stay and see Sillerton Jackson when he comes this evening. I really shan't know what to say to him."
"Poor mother! But he won't come," her son laughed, stooping to kiss away her frown. Chapter 11. Some 2 weeks later, Newland Archer, sitting in abstracted idleness in his private compartment of the office of Letterblair, Lamson and Lowe, attorneys at law, was summoned by the head of the firm. Old Mr. Letterblair, the accredited legal adviser of 3 generations of New York gentility, throned behind his mahogany desk in evident perplexity. As he stroked his close-clipped white whiskers and ran his hand through the rumpled gray locks above his jutting brows, his disrespectful junior partner thought how much he looked like the family physician, annoyed with a patient whose symptoms refuse to be classified. "My dear sir," he always addressed Archer as sir, "I have sent for you to go into a little matter. A matter which, for the moment, I prefer not to mention either to Mr. Skipworth or Mr. Redwood." The gentlemen he spoke of were the other senior partners of the firm, for, as was always the case with legal associations of old standing in New York, all the partners named on the office letterhead were long since dead. And Mr. Letterblair, for example, was, professionally speaking, his own grandson. He leaned back in his chair with a furrowed brow. "For family reasons," he continued. Archer looked up. "The Mingott family," said Mr. Letterblair, with an explanatory smile and bow. "Mrs. Manson Mingott sent for me yesterday. Her granddaughter, the Countess Olenska, wishes to sue her husband for divorce. Certain papers have been placed in my hands." He paused and drummed on his desk. "In view of your prospective alliance with the family, I should like to consult you, to consider the case with you, before taking any farther steps." Archer felt the blood in his temples. He had seen the Countess Olenska only once since his visit to her, and then at the opera in the Mingott box. During this interval she had become a less vivid and importunate image, receding from his foreground as May Welland resumed her rightful place in it. He had not heard her divorce spoken of since Janey's first random allusion to it, and had dismissed the tale as unfounded gossip.
Theoretically, the idea of divorce was almost as distasteful to him as to his mother, and he was annoyed that Mr. Letterblair, no doubt prompted by old Catherine Mingott, should be so evidently planning to draw him into the affair. After all, there were plenty of Mingott men for such jobs, and as yet he was not even a Mingott by marriage. He waited for the senior partner to continue. Mr. Letterblair unlocked a drawer and drew out a packet. "If you will run your eye over these papers." Archer frowned. "I beg your pardon, sir, but just because of the prospective relationship, I should prefer your consulting Mr. Skipworth or Mr. Redwood." Mr. Letterblair looked surprised and slightly offended. It was unusual for a junior to reject such an opening. He bowed. "I respect your scruple, sir, but in this case I believe true delicacy requires you to do as I ask. Indeed, the suggestion is not mine, but Mrs. Manson Mingott's and her son's. I have seen Lovell Mingott, and also Mr. Welland. They all named you." Archer felt his temper rising. He had been somewhat languidly drifting with events for the last fortnight, and letting May's fair looks and radiant nature obliterate the rather importunate pressure of the Mingott claims. But this behest of old Mrs. Mingott's roused him to a sense of what the clan thought they had the right to exact from a prospective son-in-law, and he chafed at the role. "Her uncles ought to deal with this," he said. "They have. The matter has been gone into by the family. They are opposed to the Countess's idea, but she is firm and insists on a legal opinion." The young man was silent. He had not opened the packet in his hand. "Does she want to marry again?" "I believe it is suggested, but she denies it." "Then, will you oblige me, Mr. Archer, by first looking through these papers? Afterward, when we have talked the case over, I will give you my opinion." Archer withdrew reluctantly with the unwelcome documents. Since their last meeting, he had half unconsciously collaborated with events in ridding himself of the burden of Madame Olenska. His hour alone with her by the firelight had drawn them into a momentary intimacy, on which the Duke of St. Austrey's intrusion with Mrs. Lemuel Struthers, and the Countess's joyous greeting of them, had rather providentially broken. 2 days later, Archer had assisted in the comedy of her reinstatement in the van der Luydens' favor, and had said to himself, with a touch of tartness, that a lady who knew how to thank all-powerful elderly gentlemen to such good purpose for a bunch of flowers did not need either the private consolations or the public championship of a young man of his small compass. To look at the matter in this light simplified his own case, and surprisingly furbished up all the dim domestic virtues. He could not picture May Welland, in whatever conceivable emergency, hawking about her private difficulties and lavishing her confidences on strange men, and she had never seemed to him finer or fairer than in the week that followed. He had even yielded to her wish for a long engagement, since she had found the one disarming answer to his plea for haste. "You know, when it comes to the point, your parents have always let you have your way ever since you were a little girl," he argued, and she had answered, with her clearest look, "Yes, and that's what makes it so hard to refuse the very last thing they'll ever ask of me as a little girl." That was the old New York note. That was the kind of answer he would like always to be sure of his wife's making. If one had habitually breathed the New York air, there were times when anything less crystalline seemed stifling. The papers he had retired to read did not tell him much, in fact, but they plunged him into an atmosphere in which he choked and spluttered. They consisted mainly of an exchange of letters between Count Olenski's solicitors and a French legal firm to whom the Countess had applied for the settlement of her financial situation. There was also a short letter from the Count to his wife. After reading it, Newland Archer rose, jammed the papers back into their envelope, and re-entered Mr. Letterblair's office. "Here are the letters, sir. If you wish, I'll see Madame Olenska," he said in a constrained voice. Thank you, Mr. Archer. Come and dine with me tonight if you're free, and we'll go into the matter afterward, in case you wish to call on our client tomorrow." Newland Archer walked straight home again that afternoon. It was a winter evening of transparent clearness, with an innocent young moon above the housetops, and he wanted to fill his soul's lungs with a pure radiance and not exchange a word with anyone till he and Mr. Letterblair were closeted together after dinner. It was impossible to decide otherwise than he had done. He must see Madame Olenska himself, rather than let her secrets be bared to other eyes. A great wave of compassion had swept away his indifference and impatience. She stood before him as an exposed and pitiful figure, to be saved at all costs from farther wounding herself in her mad plunges against fate. He remembered what she had told him of Mrs. Welland's request to be spared whatever was unpleasant in her history, and winced at the thought that it was perhaps this attitude of mind which kept the New York air so pure. Are we only Pharisees, after all? He wondered, puzzled by the effort to reconcile his instinctive disgust at human vileness with his equally instinctive pity for human frailty. For the first time he perceived how elementary his own principles had always been. He passed for a young man who had not been afraid of risks, and he knew that his secret love affair with poor, silly Mrs. Thoroughly Rushworth had not been too secret to invest him with a becoming air of adventure. But Mrs. Rushworth was that kind of woman. Foolish, vain, clandestine by nature, and far more attracted by the secrecy and peril of the affair than by such charms and qualities as he possessed. When the fact dawned on him, it nearly broke his heart, but now it seemed the redeeming feature of the case. The affair, in short, had been of the kind that most of the young men of his age had been through, and emerged from with calm consciences and an undisturbed belief in the abysmal distinction between the women one loved and respected and those one enjoyed and pitied. In this view, they were sedulously abetted by their mothers, aunts, and other elderly female relatives, who all shared Mrs. Archer's belief that when such things happened, it was undoubtedly foolish of the man, but somehow always criminal of the woman. All the elderly ladies whom Archer knew regarded any woman who loved imprudently as necessarily unscrupulous and designing, and mere simple-minded man as powerless in her clutches. The only thing to do was to persuade him, as early as possible, to marry a nice girl, and then trust to her to look after him. In the complicated old European communities, Archer began to guess, love problems might be less simple and less easily classified. Rich and idle and ornamental societies must produce many more such situations, and there might even be one in which a woman naturally sensitive and aloof would yet, from the force of circumstances, from sheer defenselessness and loneliness, be drawn into a tie inexcusable by conventional standards. On reaching home, he wrote a line to the Countess Olenska, asking at what hour of the next day she would receive him, and dispatched it by a messenger boy, who returned presently with a word to the effect that she was going to Skuytercliff the next morning to stay over Sunday with the van der Luydens, but that he would find her alone that evening after dinner. The note was written on a rather untidy half-sheet, without date or address, but her hand was firm and free. He was amused at the idea of her week-ending in the stately solitude of Skuytercliff, but immediately afterward he felt that there, of all places, she would most feel the chill of minds rigorously averted from the unpleasant. He was at Mr. Letterblair's punctually at 7.
glad of the pretext for excusing himself soon after dinner. He had formed his own opinion from the papers entrusted to him, and did not especially want to go into the matter with his senior partner. Mr. Letterblair was a widower, and they dined alone, copiously and slowly, in a dark, shabby room hung with yellowing prints of the death of Chatham and the coronation of Napoleon. On the sideboard, between fluted Sheraton knife cases, stood a decanter of Haute Brion, and another of the old Lanning port, the gift of a client, which the wastrel Tom Lanning had sold off a year or two before his mysterious and discreditable death in San Francisco, an incident less publicly humiliating to the family than the sale of the cellar. After a velvety oyster soup came shad and cucumbers, then a young broiled turkey with corn fritters, followed by a canvas back with currant jelly and a celery mayonnaise. Mr. Letterblair, who lunched on sandwich and tea, dined deliberately and deeply, and insisted on his guests doing the same. Finally, when the closing rites had been accomplished, the cloth was removed, cigars were lit, and Mr. Letterblair, leaning back in his chair and pushing the port westward, said, spreading his back agreeably to the coal fire behind him, "The whole family are against a divorce, and I think rightly." Archer instantly felt himself on the other side of the argument. "But why, sir? If there ever was a case, well, what's the use? She's here, he's there, the Atlantic's between them. She'll never get back $1 more of her money than what he's voluntarily returned to her. Their damn heathen marriage settlements take precious good care of that. As things go over there, Olenski's acted generously. He might have turned her out without a penny." The young man knew this, and was silent. "I understand, though," Mr. Letterblair continued, "that she attaches no importance to the money. Therefore, as the family say, why not let well enough alone?" Archer had gone to the house an hour earlier in full agreement with Mr. Letterblair's view. But put into words by this selfish, well-fed, and supremely indifferent old man, it suddenly became the Pharisaic voice of a society wholly absorbed in barricading itself against the unpleasant. "I think that's for her to decide." Have you considered the consequences if she decides for divorce?" "You mean the threat in her husband's letter? What weight would that carry? It's no more than the vague charge of an angry blackguard." "Yes, but it might make some unpleasant talk if he really defends the suit." "Unpleasant?" said Archer explosively. Mr. Letterblair looked at him from under inquiring eyebrows, and the young man, aware of the uselessness of trying to explain what was in his mind, bowed acquiescently while his senior continued, "Divorce is always unpleasant." "You agree with me?" Mr. Letterblair resumed, after a waiting silence. "Naturally," said Archer. "Well, then, I may count on you. The Mingotts may count on you to use your influence against the idea." Archer hesitated. "I can't pledge myself till I've seen the Countess Olenska," he said at length. "Mr. Archer, I don't understand you. Do you want to marry into a family with a scandalous divorce suit hanging over it?" "I don't think that has anything to do with the case." Mr. Letterblair put down his glass of port and fixed on his young partner a cautious and apprehensive gaze. Archer understood that he ran the risk of having this mandate withdrawn, and for some obscure reason he disliked the prospect. Now that the job had been thrust on him, he did not propose to relinquish it. And to guard against the possibility, he saw that he must reassure the unimaginative old man who was the legal conscience of the Mingotts. "You may be sure, sir, that I shan't commit myself till I've reported to you. What I meant was that I'd rather not give an opinion till I've heard what Madame Olenska has to say."
Mr. Letterblair nodded approvingly at an excess of caution, worthy of the best New York tradition, and the young man, glancing at his watch, pleaded an engagement and took leave. Chapter 12. Old-fashioned New York dined at 7, and the habit of after-dinner calls, though derided in Archer's set, still generally prevailed. As the young man strolled up Fifth Avenue from Waverly Place, the long thoroughfare was deserted, but for a group of carriages standing before the Reggie Chiverses, where there was a dinner for the Duke, and the occasional figure of an elderly gentleman in heavy overcoat and muffler ascending a brownstone doorstep and disappearing into a gaslit hall. Thus, as Archer crossed Washington Square, he remarked that old Mr. Dulac was calling on his cousins the Dagonets, and turning down the corner of West 10th Street, he saw Mr. Skipworth, of his own firm, obviously bound on a visit to the Miss Lannings. A little farther up Fifth Avenue, Beaufort appeared on his doorstep, darkly projected against a blaze of light, descended to his private brougham, and rolled away to a mysterious and probably unmentionable destination. It was not an opera night, and no one was giving a party, so the Beaufort's outing was undoubtedly of a clandestine nature. Archer connected it in his mind with a little house beyond Lexington Avenue, in which beribboned window curtains and flower boxes had recently appeared, and before whose newly painted door the canary-colored brougham of Miss Fanny Ring was frequently seen to wait. Beyond the small and slippery pyramid which composed Mrs. Archer's world lay the almost unmapped quarter inhabited by artists, musicians, and people who wrote. These scattered fragments of humanity had never shown any desire to be amalgamated with the social structure. In spite of odd ways, they were said to be, for the most part, quite respectable, but they preferred to keep to themselves. Medora Manson, in her prosperous days, had inaugurated a literary salon, but it had soon died out owing to the reluctance of the literary to frequent it. Others had made the same attempt, and there was a household of Blenkers, an intense and voluble mother, and 3 blousy daughters who imitated her, where one met Edwin Booth and Patty and William Winter, and the new Shakespearean actor George Reinold, and some of the magazine editors and musical and literary critics. Mrs. Archer and her group felt a certain timidity concerning these persons. They were odd. They were uncertain. They had things one didn't know about in the background of their lives and minds. Literature and art were deeply respected in the Archer set, and Mrs. Archer was always at pains to tell her children how much more agreeable and cultivated society had been when it included such figures as Washington Irving, Fitz Greene Halleck, and the poet of the culprit Fay. The most celebrated authors of that generation had been gentlemen. Perhaps the unknown persons who succeeded them had gentlemanly sentiments, but their origin, their appearance, their hair, their intimacy with the stage and the opera made any old New York criterion inapplicable to them. "When I was a girl," Mrs. Archer used to say, "we knew everybody between the Battery and Canal Street, and only the people one knew had carriages. It was perfectly easy to place anyone then. Now one can't tell, and I prefer not to try." Only old Catherine Mingott, with her absence of moral prejudices and almost parvenu indifference to the subtler distinctions, might have bridged the abyss, but she had never opened a book or looked at a picture, and cared for music only because it reminded her of gala nights at the Italiens in the days of her triumph at the Tuileries. Possibly Beaufort, who was her match in daring, would have succeeded in bringing about a fusion, but his grand house and silk-stockinged footmen were an obstacle to the informal sociability. Moreover, he was as illiterate as old Mrs. Mingott, and considered fellows who wrote as the mere paid purveyors of rich men's pleasures. and no one rich enough to influence his opinion had ever questioned it. Newland Archer had been aware of these things ever since he could remember, and had accepted them as part of the structure of his universe. He knew that there were societies where painters and poets and novelists and men of science and even great actors were as sought after as dukes. He had often pictured to himself what it would have been to live in the intimacy of drawing rooms dominated by the talk of Mérimée, whose lettre à une inconnue was one of his inseparables. Of Thackeray, Browning, or William Morris. But such things were inconceivable in New York, and unsettling to think of. Archer knew most of the fellows who wrote, the musicians and the painters. He met them at the Century, or at the little musical and theatrical clubs that were beginning to come into existence. He enjoyed them there, and was bored with them at the Blenkers, where they were mingled with fervid and dowdy women who passed them about like captured curiosities. And even after his most exciting talks with Ned Winsett, he always came away with a feeling that if his world was small, so was theirs, and that the only way to enlarge either was to reach a stage of manners where they would naturally merge. He was reminded of this by trying to picture the society in which the Countess Olenska had lived and suffered, and also, perhaps, tasted mysterious joys. He remembered with what amusement she had told him that her grandmother Mingott and the Wellens objected to her living in a bohemian quarter given over to people who wrote. It was not the peril but the poverty that her family disliked. But that shade escaped her, and she supposed they considered literature compromising. She herself had no fears of it, and the books scattered about her drawing room, a part of the house in which books were usually supposed to be out of place, though chiefly works of fiction, had whetted Archer's interest with such new names as those of Paul Bourget, Huysmans, and the Goncourt brothers. Ruminating on these things as he approached her door, he was once more conscious of the curious way in which she reversed his values, and of the need of thinking himself into conditions incredibly different from any that he knew if he were to be of use in her present difficulty. Nastasia opened the door, smiling mysteriously. On the bench in the hall lay a sable-lined overcoat, a folded opera hat of dull silk with a gold J.B. on the lining, and a white silk muffler. There was no mistaking the fact that these costly articles were the property of Julius Beaufort. Archer was angry. So angry that he came near scribbling a word on his card and going away. Then he remembered that in writing to Madame Olenska, he had been kept by excess of discretion from saying that he wished to see her privately. He had therefore no one but himself to blame if she had opened her doors to other visitors, and he entered the drawing-room with the dogged determination to make Beaufort feel himself in the way and to outstay him. The banker stood leaning against the mantel-shelf, which was draped with an old embroidery held in place by brass candelabra containing church candles of yellowish wax. He had thrust his chest out, supporting his shoulders against the mantel and resting his weight on one large patent-leather foot. As Archer entered, he was smiling and looking down on his hostess, who sat on a sofa placed at right angles to the chimney. A table banked with flowers formed a screen behind it, and against the orchids and azaleas, which the young man recognized as tributes from the Beauforts' hothouses, Madame Olenska sat half-reclined, her head propped on a hand, and her wide sleeve leaving the arm bare to the elbow. It was usual for ladies who received in the evenings to wear what were called simple dinner dresses. A close-fitting armor of whalebone silk, slightly open in the neck, with lace ruffles filling in the crack, and tight sleeves with a flounce uncovering just enough wrist to show an Etruscan gold bracelet or a velvet band. But Madame Olenska, heedless of tradition, was attired in a long robe of red velvet bordered about the chin and down the front with glossy black fur. Archer remembered, on his last visit to Paris, Seeing a portrait by the new painter, Carolus Duran, whose pictures were the sensation of the salon, in which the lady wore one of these bold, sheath-like robes with her chin nestling in fur. There was something perverse and provocative in the notion of fur worn in the evening in a heated drawing-room, and in the combination of a muffled throat and bare arms, but the effect was undeniably pleasing. "Lord love us! 3 whole days at Skuyter Cliff," Beaufort was saying in his loud, sneering voice as Archer entered. "You'd better take all your furs and hot water bottle."
"Why? Is the house so cold?" she asked, holding out her left hand to Archer, in a way mysteriously suggesting that she expected him to kiss it.
"No, but the missus is," said Beaufort, nodding carelessly to the young man.
"But I thought her so kind. She came herself to invite me. Granny says I must certainly go."
"Granny would, of course. And I say it's a shame you're going to miss the little oyster supper I had planned for you at Delmonico's next Sunday, with Campanini and Scalchi and a lot of jolly people."
She looked doubtfully from the banker to Archer. "Ha, that does tempt me. Except the other evening at Mrs. Struthers's, I've not met a single artist since I've been here."
"What kind of artists?" "I know 1 or 2 painters, very good fellows, that I could bring to see you if you'd allow me," said Archer boldly. "Painters? Are there painters in New York?" asked Beaufort, in a tone implying that there could be none since he did not buy their pictures. And Madame Olenska said to Archer, with her grave smile, "That would be charming. But I was really thinking of dramatic artists, singers, actors, musicians. My husband's house was always full of them." She said the words, "my husband," as if no sinister associations were connected with them, and in a tone that seemed almost to sigh over the lost delights of her married life. Archer looked at her perplexedly, wondering if it were lightness or dissimulation that enabled her to touch so easily on the past at the very moment when she was risking her reputation in order to break with it. "I do think," she went on, addressing both men, "that the imprévu adds to one's enjoyment. It's perhaps a mistake to see the same people every day." "It's confoundedly dull, anyhow. New York is dying of dullness," Beaufort grumbled. "And when I try to liven it up for you, you go back on me. Come, think better of it. Sunday is your last chance, for Campanini leaves next week for Baltimore and Philadelphia. And I've a private room and a Steinway, and they'll sing all night for me."
"How delicious. May I think it over and write you tomorrow morning?" She spoke amiably, yet with the least hint of dismissal in her voice. Beaufort evidently felt it, and being unused to dismissals, stood staring at her with an obstinate line between his eyes.
"Why not now?"
"It's too serious a question to decide at this late hour."
"Do you call it late?"
She returned his glance coolly. "Yes, because I have still to talk business with Mr. Archer for a little while."
"Ah," Beaufort snapped.
There was no appeal from her tone, and with a slight shrug he recovered his composure, took her hand, which he kissed with a practiced air, and calling out from the threshold, "I say, Newland, if you can persuade the Countess to stop in town, of course you're included in the supper." He left the room with his heavy, important step. For a moment Archer fancied that Mr. Letterblair must have told her of his coming, but the irrelevance of her next remark made him change his mind. "You know painters, then? You live in their milieu?" she asked, her eyes full of interest.
"Oh, not exactly. I don't know that the artists have a milieu here. Any of them. They're more like a very thinly settled outskirt."
"But you care for such things?"
"Immensely. When I'm in Paris or London, I never miss an exhibition. I try to keep up."
She looked down at the tip of the little satin boot that peeped from her long draperies. I used to care immensely, too. My life was full of such things. But now I want to try not to.
You want to try not to?
Yes. I want to cast off all my old life, to become just like everybody else here.
Archer reddened. You'll never be like everybody else, he said.
She raised her straight eyebrows a little. Ha, don't say that. If you knew how I hate to be different. Her face had grown as somber as a tragic mask. She leaned forward, clasping her knee in her thin hands, and looking away from him in remote, dark distances. I want to get away from it all, she insisted. He waited a moment and cleared his throat.
I know. Mr. Letterblair has told me.
Ah?
That's the reason I've come. He asked me to. You see, I'm in the firm.
She looked slightly surprised, and then her eyes brightened. You mean you can manage it for me? I can talk to you instead of Mr. Letterblair? Oh, that will be so much easier. Her tone touched him, and his confidence grew with his self-satisfaction. He perceived that she had spoken of business to Beaufort simply to get rid of him, and to have routed Beaufort was something of a triumph.